Childcare was seen as kind of a menial job.
Black and brown women have been caring for other people's children outside of our race since the dawn of time.
My grandmother's philosophy was that she saw the positive in every child she met.
We've come a very long way, but we still have a way to go.
So at the end of the day, what gives me hope is that I think we've finally gotten to the point where we realize this is a universal issue that impacts all of us.
The history of early childhood education is one built on inequities. Whether it's race, gender, or simply the individual financial and cultural struggles of parents, caretakers, and providers, the crisis is familiar. It's the soaring cost of childcare, finding accessible, affordable, quality providers, being able to hire enough qualified caregivers and teachers, and providing them with a livable wage. And it's a story that goes back to the earliest days of the United States.
You have to historically look at the origins of child care, right, which extend into slavery. And so that begins this idea that Black women and then brown women are able to take care of children and do not require any additional skill or any additional talent other than just watching children to keep them safe and feeding them.
We know the racism history, racial history of everything that stemmed from that. Black and brown women have been caring for other people's children outside of our race since the dawn of time.
For hundreds of years, childcare took place at home, as Maurice Sykes, author and early childhood education expert, calls it, by mammies, nannies, and wet nurses.
Childcare was seen as kind of a menial job, and because it involved things like, as somebody indelicately put it, feeding one end and wiping the other, and it was also not very well paid. It didn't require any kind of professional training or education particularly.
But there would be a shift in the childcare tides when the profession went from what most saw as babysitting to the science of educating babies.
The early childhood education or nursery school movement began in the late 19th or early 20th century, and like most women's professions, the people in it were very careful to maintain their professionalism, their professional credibility.
Washington, D.C. has been a leader in the field of early childhood education for decades, perhaps longer than most even know. Almost 100 years ago, the National Child Research Center was founded, thanks to a grant from a well-known family who was looking for a better environment for their neurodiverse child.
NCRC began in 1928. There was seed money put in by one of the Rockefeller family members, a mom, who had a child with identified needs, and she felt that it was really essential that her child have the opportunity to attend school with neurotypical children.
At that time, NCRC really was a research center. People are kind of baffled by NCRC, National Child Research Center. What are you doing? Do you have lab rats? Are these children being tested? There was research going on, and it was all with the right sort of thrust and philosophy.
NCRC brought a different style of early childhood education to Washington, D.C., one that began many years earlier overseas, that focused on a child's natural ability and desire to explore through play.
Because we've always embraced a play-based approach to learning, that from the very foundation of the program, the idea was that the work of children is play, and that children learn best when they are exploring and investigating and diving deep through play as a vehicle for learning.
The Rockefeller grant only lasted a few years, but the seeds were planted for success and community. NCRC parents got together and raised the money needed to make their center a permanent fixture on the D.C. early childhood education landscape.
The parent community purchased the property and started the school. It's always been a nonprofit, but they began charging tuition, and they were able to sustain the program that way. As the field of child development became a much more serious scientific pursuit, so to speak, when people started looking at child development and more research was happening, I think it was probably in the 40s when things began to blossom.
But NCRC wasn't the only center in D.C. breaking new ground in the early 20th century. In 1929, Dorothy Howard, a native Washingtonian and D.C. public school teacher, opened the Garden of Children in Ward 1. In doing so, she not only broke a color barrier in her neighborhood regarding home ownership, but she also found a way to provide something more than just babysitting for her own child.
That's my grandmother and my mother, and that's Madeline Lemon, who taught in the school for years, much beloved. That's me looking at them. I see that to me, when I see this picture, she's giving someone a stern eye, and I can tell by the look on my face that I'm like, ooh. She had been studying this newfangled idea called nursery schools. She couldn't bear the idea of leaving my mother because she had waited so long to have this child. So she decided to step out in faith and start a nursery school. And she named it Garden of Children, which is the literal translation of the word kindergarten from German. So the earliest students there were my mother's lifelong friends, and it grew and grew and grew. Eventually it went up to the 3rd grade because she couldn't bear to not have my mother there. I know now, as an adult and a historian, that we were a very segregated city. But at the time, I wasn't as aware of it. Perhaps I knew that we were all African Americans, but I did not feel that there was anything negative about being African American. And my grandmother's philosophy was that she saw the positive in every child she met. It was, you've got to be your best self. It's 1950, I see from the picture. And every morning, school opened with the circle. She had several guideposts that she hammered home. One is the overriding thing of conveying love to children and finding the best in a child and encouraging them. You build the child's self-esteem and love.
Even in Washington in the 1960s, there were challenges to keeping a child care center open. And Dorothy Howard knew that at that point, it was comply or close.
She had to close because of the modern day building codes. And she pondered over it quite a bit. What to do. She decided that she just probably should go on and retire. And if you think about people having a mission in life, her mission in life was early childhood education.
Perhaps the biggest shift in U.S. child care history came in the mid-20th century when America went to war. The men were sent to fight, and many women took their place on the factory front lines. With mothers going to work, their children needed child care. The Lanham Act, passed in 1940, recognized that women on the job needed help. So those working in the war effort had on-site child care available 6 days a week.
We had the Lanham Act, which pretty much provided universal pre-K, and there was no shame. Historically, women had stayed at home. Now they were pressed into the workforce. They needed child care. And the women who worked at that time in child care were paid a fairly, what we call a worthy wage at that time.
So with Rosie the Riveter, we were comfortable providing child care because, again, it was only for this extreme case, this extreme scenario where women had to engage as part of the labor force.
However, when the soldiers came home, the women were sent home, and child care once again became the domain of women.
The war and the need for workers clearly trumped the prevailing ideology, which was that mothers should stay home with their children. But there was still tremendous ambivalence about it in the post-war decades. Married women's labor force participation and mothers' labor force participation climbed steadily. After the war, many women, including mothers, went into the labor force because they wanted to improve their family's standard of living.
The standard of living may have been improving for some families after World War II, but the black-white divide, especially in the South, which included Washington, D.C., was continuing to sharpen in focus.
African American women had always worked. They had worked, of course, when they were enslaved, so black women were always used to working. And D.C. had a large black population as a kind of quasi-southern state.
That population was about to get a public policy assist when, in 1964, as part of President Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, Head Start made headlines. The plan was to create a comprehensive childhood development program that would support the needs of the disadvantaged.
Head Start is the first actual federal investment in early care and education very early on. And it was designed to meet the needs of our poorest children through a systems approach, because it has health, nutrition, parent engagement and involvement, as well as the early care and education side of it.
I would argue that it was predicated on a pathology model that poor parents didn't know how to rear their children, and therefore they needed the government to be a model. It certainly has persevered low these, 50 or more years. So it has sustainability and it has great outcomes.
Head Start provided low-income children with high-quality early education. It has created so many benefits for the children and the parents who enrolled in Head Start. But it still serves only about 40% of poor 3- and 4-year-olds today.
The Head Start was never seen as a way to incentivize women to enter the labor force. It was a very, effective, very enriched, very thoughtfully constructed program, but it was also presented as compensation for some kind of cultural deprivation at home. So it kind of gave with one hand and took away with the other.
Despite any perceived policy problems, Head Start has not only been around for almost 6 decades. For many, it's been their main source of support.
We also know that in Black and brown communities, when we think about how many children die in childbirth and die at an early age because of the lack of resources, I'm always surprised that we have not made that investment. Head Start is the only federal program that has survived, and I think that in and of itself says a lot.
Head Start was making a difference, but the nationwide push for accessible, affordable childcare hit a political wall when Richard Nixon vetoed the bipartisan Comprehensive Child Development Act in 1971, which would have created federally funded public child care centers across the country.
And he said because it would take the moral, ethical prerogative of the family's child rearing away from the family and sort of socialized. It was socialism. We were moving towards socialism.
It totally changed the trajectory of early care and education in the United States. We could have looked more like our peer nations if Nixon had signed that bill. It would have provided affordable, high-quality child care, and it was a disservice to young children. It was a disservice to mothers. And unfortunately, it resulted in lost opportunity over decades.
But inequities don't die easily. And despite the need, funding inequality was and is still part of everyday child care life. And in addition to trying to find accessible, affordable, quality child care, now science was adding another layer of concern to parents and providers when it came to child care.
In the 80s and 90s, we started changing the language from child care to child development. And we started to bring in the neurobiology of childhood. And that started to change the conversation.
Despite national challenges, inconsistent policies state to state and city to city when it comes to supporting accessible, affordable, and quality childcare as a public good, Washington, D.C. has continued to move forward and take a leadership role in early childhood education. And one of childcare's most vocal advocates has been on the front lines for over 4 decades.
I was appointed by Marion Barry, who said, I don't want any babysitting, I want child development. So we had strong support during the Barry years, then the Sharon Pratt Kelly, then Marion again, and then Tony Williams. Then during the Fenty years, well, when Fenty was on the council, he helped us get a $37 million increase, which was just fabulous. Maurice Sykes was at the school system simultaneously. I was at the mayor's level, and we worked collaboratively and building support for what eventually became the Pre-K for All DC law, which happened during the Fenty time. And we had strong business support. The Federal City Council, the Chamber, the other business organizations, the bankers, the architects. We worked with all of them because, you know what? They all needed child care.
Washington, D.C. continued to innovate policy, despite changes taking decades. A major shift came in 2008, when D.C. took a step backward in order to move forward, and launched a program that most closely resembled America in the wartime 1940s. Washington became the only jurisdiction in the country with universal pre-K, free preschool for all D.C. 3- and 4-year-olds.
By 2008, there were a confluence of things that were happening in the District of Columbia. The charter legislation in the District of Columbia allowed charter schools to start with 3-year-olds and eventually get us to pass the Pre-K for all DC legislation.
We did have 100% support of the pre-K part at the council. But they didn't get it with the infant and toddler. The deal was, the council said, if you take out the birth to 3 piece, we'll go with it.
We really wanted that legislation to be a 0 to 5, but the political winds were such, the moment was such that we could only get the votes for pre-K.
Even with the political winds not always blowing on the side of early childhood education advocates, there were many in the field that continued to push for change, including the Bainum Family Foundation, a nonprofit that focuses on children and families.
Then Bainum put out its report that place-based made a difference and that the services for children, young children, were not very good in certain communities, particularly Black and brown communities. And they then provided some resources to every group that's working in the early childhood space.
So it took those 10 years to really get to the political will to a place where we could get a piece of legislation that was focused on birth to 3.
Part of that effort to focus was the Bainum Family Foundation creating the Birth to 3 Policy Alliance, which became an even broader coalition of advocates called Under 3 DC.
Under 3 DC is a coalition of more than 40 organizations, but it also includes parents, grandparents, teachers, center and family child care home directors, representatives from child care associations, advocates. It's a pretty broad-based coalition of folks, and the goal is to fully fund the Birth to 3 law.
So the Birth to 3 legislation lays out this very compelling vision of universal access to early childhood education and supporting affordability for a much broader range of families.
And part of the Birth to 3 legislation is that parents do not pay, under accessibility, is that parents do not pay more than 10% of their income.
Birth to 3 is so much more comprehensive because it includes the health components, the mental health components. The biggest piece, of course, is around the child care.
The idea is that we would just have a significant public investment that would allow families a lot more ease in finding and affording care for their children.
Creating accessible, affordable, quality child care is only one piece of the early child care education puzzle. An essential piece was looking at the systems from the workforce point of view. And as recent history has proved, where there is a child care will, there's a political way.
We know that brain development is so critical during those first 3 years, and we want an investment in quality, not just a quantity of care. But you also want to make sure that you have the workforce available, and so you have the financial issues around the business of childcare and how costly it is to do.
The financial issues. They impact parents and caretakers, providers, teachers, everyone in the field. But one of the biggest challenges is keeping qualified staff when the pay rate for child care teachers is so much lower than what they could be earning in the public school system. And once again, DC found a way, passing the wealth tax in 2021, which increased child care salaries to compete with the pay provided in public and charter schools.
The legislation addresses the pay equity issues that are really critical to make sure that those, mostly women, but we are able to compensate in similar ways as teachers in the school system.
Pay equity is essential to keep quality teachers in early childhood education, and the wealth tax does help to fill the gap.
And so the wealth tax is in fact one of those very critical pieces because it should stabilize the workforce.
We are extraordinarily grateful that the city has created a fund that will raise the salaries of our teachers.
But like so many policies, advances in early childhood education can create systemic challenges and require a mindset reset.
We need to change our orientation as a nation about how we think about childcare as a social good, something like a public library or a police force. And the wealth tax is I think, an innovative idea for raising that money, and I'm sure there are many other solutions.
I don't see birth to 3 as the be-all, end-all of our early childhood system. It's a really important starting point. It's been such a powerful unifier of our policymakers. I think that if it ends up being fully funded, that will be an incredible start to building an early childhood system in the district.
Thanks to a history of innovative advocates, centers, and policies, Washington, D.C., despite not having voting representation in Congress or being a state, continues to be a leader in the early childhood education arena on the national stage. When federal programs are put in place, they were often born in the nation's capital.
DC has been a forerunner for 50 years now.
We've come a very long way, but we still have a way to go. Our frame has to be around quality programs that impact the economy and economic vitality of the community, that they form the foundation. And the big thing that I think we're going to have to do in DC is to help people understand that the birth to 3 is as much of a part of the public good and should be treated the same way as pre-K. No other state has universal pre-K. They have pilot programs. But we are serving, over 90% of the 4s and 80-some% of the 3s without regard to zip code. We haven't done enough about the resources going to the provider community and the thinking differently about everybody. It's not one size fits all.
But there is still a long way to go to erase historical inequities and create an even playing field for all children in the 0 to 3 space. And if recent history is a guide, there are also mental and historical speed bumps to overcome. In short, change will come with a shift in thinking.
This attitude has persisted throughout the generations, that this is Black and brown women work that doesn't require any additional education, and that it's babysitting, and that they're capable of doing that without regard to their own families, to their own development, and to their own career.
I want to make sure that we aren't further marginalizing certain people that are, what we call it, east of the river or west of the river or the park, that we are closing the gap around wealth and resources rather than making it worse.
Early childhood education in Washington, D.C. is a work in progress, although the progress made in D.C. is seen and emulated elsewhere. And as the years tick by, NCRC continues on their way toward their own centennial celebration by building on their almost 100 years of experience, the idea that diversity and inclusion is key. They are still following the plan they put in place in 1928 because it's working.
It is a play-based curriculum, and we are not going to be starting to teach phonics. We're not going to start to teach pre-algebra, but children are going to get every precept they need to be proficient at reading, writing, mathematics, science. All of those seeds are planted.
What was put in place in the late 1920s is now a core principle of many early childhood education centers in D.C. today. Which means that the business of children is still play.
Because there's one swing.
There is one swing and 2 friends.
And this purposeful play adds value and learning opportunities to a child's education.
Ready, set?
Yeah.
Go!
It is truly about the whole child. What I love is that we're focused specifically on these very important early years in which development is so rich. It's imperative that all the steps are taken for children to have a great start.
Who's next?
Me.
Good at taking your turn.
We work with parents to help them in finding the supports that they need to be the best parents that they can be, and supporting their child and working collaboratively with us and the teaching team to move forward.
Okay, we're going to do a move-in this time, Idris. Level 2.
Washington, D.C. has always been a leader in early childhood education, and continues to lead in terms of incorporating neurodiversity and inclusion into early learning plans.
Yeah, you guys worked hard. Yes, Mom, working hard.
So our oldest had some developmental delays and challenges. And so from the time he was 2, we were in this like whirlwind of early intervention. And when we came here to look at schools, this was the first place we really felt like these guys got our kid.
I love that we can use inclusion in both ways, in making sure that our diverse community feels included, and inclusion in this education aspect where you really see how great it is when people from all backgrounds and people who need all support can learn and grow in the same space.
For me, it was really hard thinking he had a career of being the kind of the kid in the corner. That great kid, wonderful at home, but then at school he's lost. And NCRC brought him out.
Right? Yeah, that's it. Like on our playground. But they didn't have.
When I look back at the historical documents, I'm actually very moved by what I see. When I look at the letters of support that were drafted early on to create NCRC, people who in the 20s and the 30s recognized that it was really important to look at early development and to bring together expertise to support children having the best opportunities to flourish.
Okay, we can do that. Are you going to drive? All right, go ahead, buddy.
And we are coming up on 100 years, and it's incredibly meaningful that we've been able to sustain for almost 100 years. We've stayed true to the idea that the work of children is play and held firm to that. And I think that says a lot about our conviction to really serve children.
You can have history, you can have a beautiful building, a nice playground like this, but if the teachers aren't the right mix, then it's not going to be a great program.
DC continues to build on history to prepare for the future in the field of early childhood education. But as historians and advocates will say, it's not just about creating policies. It's something much more ingrained that needs an adjustment.
It's not a blind spot, it's a mental model. And the mental model goes back to indentured servitude and enslavement. And so that is slave work. And it also goes to our perception of women. In other words, we've built this industry called childcare through the exploitation of women.
I think the first thing we have to do is acknowledge it. Acknowledge that, this experience of caregivers being expected to care for someone's child with no regard for their own well-being stems all the way back to wet nursing and slavery times. And so we have to really think about the way that we've treated women of color in this workforce.
We don't value women in this country the way that we should. We don't treat people of color as equal members of our society. And I think that is still the crux of the matter. I think people generally care about small children, but they think they can get that work for free because they don't in the same way care about the people who do the work.
So I think there are times when we think about childcare, rethinking childcare, reframing childcare, we forget that families need access to a range of services, a range of choices, and need to be supported regardless of the choice they make.
There is still a national crisis in terms of early childhood education. When it comes to policy, the advances are uneven or non-existent, and in some cases, merely band-aids to help stop the flow of inequity. In order to truly change systemic issues, there will need to be a change in the mental model. But the news is not all bad.
We are seeing a lot of bright spots. It's just that you're right in terms of the inequities, even within a state or a community, not everybody's accessing that just yet.
I do think it will take a mindset shift kind of across the board. So I think that's with the city, that's with the taxpayers, I think that's in the education space.
So at the end of the day, what gives me hope is that I think we've finally gotten to the point where we realize this is a universal issue that impacts all of us.
What did she say, you guys?